Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 302, Doing Jewish. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. Hanukkah is about to come. And Hanukkah, for all kinds of reasons that we've discussed on the podcast before, is a time that we think it's really good to think about this whole question of how does Judaism change? What happens when Judaism encounters other cultures? What should happen? What does tend to happen? And our guest today, Zack Bodner, has written a book that raises these questions really squarely and in really interesting ways, largely because of his experiences running the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, which, as all of our listeners know, we love very much and we're part of in all kinds of interesting ways. We're having this conversation today because Zack Bodner has just released Why Do Jewish? A manifesto for 21st century Jewish peoplehood, in which he wants to shift the question from why be Jewish to why do Jewish. And we'll explore why that's an important shift in Zack's mind, and ultimately towards the bringing about of a new concept of Jewish peoplehood that may well be a new way of organizing our thinking about Judaism. Zack Bodner is the CEO of the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, which has been involved with a lot of really forward-thinking Jewish organizations, including us. Under Zack Bodner's leadership, the Oshman family JCC has also created the Center for Social Impact, which is committed to helping repair the world through initiatives that address poverty, disaster relief, racial justice, civic responsibility, and more. It has also launched the Toby Center for Jewish Peoplehood, which hosts the Architects of the Jewish Future series along with us, as well as the Kol Isha Women's Leadership Development Program. And Zack has also led the creation of the Z3 project, Zionism 3.0, which is a global effort to reimagine diaspora-Israel relations. You can find out more about the book and order it through whydojewish.com, or you can also buy the book at whatever your favorite book retailer is. So let's get into this conversation about why do Jewish. Zack Bodner, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be on the show again. Great to see you both. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to get into some of the concepts that are in your book. Some of them we've talked about in the past, but some of them I don't think we've really drilled down to in the past, and I think it's really interesting. So I know this is something that kind of comes in the middle of the book, but I was interested if we could start with this idea of West Coast Judaism, because I think that to see your book as kind of, you talk about it as a manifesto, but a particular manifesto that comes out of a specific place in a specific time might actually help us understand more what we're seeing here. So could you talk a little bit about what you see as West Coast Judaism and how it's different and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you're asking this question right off the bat, Dan, because in many ways, what you and Lex are doing is West Coast Judaism. I know you're not here physically, but you're here virtually, and you do come here from time to time. So you get it. You know what West Coast Judaism looks like. But I actually believe that if we believe that East Coast Jews created the last 100 years of American Jewish life, as I do, think federations and JCCs, think big synagogues, big rituals, to even the things that are more cultural, Dan. If you think about Jewish food, we think about New York deli. If we think about Jewish humor, we think about the Borscht Belt. If we think about, literacy, and we think about Broadway, that all comes out of, New York. But I think the next 100 years of American Jewish life could very well be built by West Coast Jews. A lot of the old ways are not working for us, Dan. A lot of the traditions are kind of a little bit stagnant for West Coast Jews, right? These are the folks that are trying to make things a little bit differently. And so we see the old ways and we say, okay, that might work a little bit, but how are we able to to pivot off it and innovate? Just by our nature, West Coasters are a little bit more in the trailblazer category, right? The move fast and break things model of Facebook and the big tech companies out here. We are used to doing things in an untraditional way. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it also is just part of our mindset, right? We are the folks who are just used to breaking glass. And number three, there's a tremendous amount of wealth out here, right? If you think about the massive tech wealth that's been generated over the last decade, that's going to provide us an opportunity to experiment and try new things. And that's why you're seeing these really cool, innovative Jewish projects come out of the West Coast, right? That's why you're seeing At the Well. That's why you're seeing Moshe House. That's why you're seeing Urban Adamah. That's why you're seeing Jewish Studio Project. And I'm naming these folks because you know who they are. You've had them on your show, but a lot of them are coming out of the West Coast because we're not held back by the old traditional bonds. This is Judaism Unbound, after all. Maybe the East Coast still hems people in a way that we don't have that out here, Dan. So that's why I think that, first of all, the title of your show is amazing, but that's why I think West Coast Judaism could define the future.
First of all, what you said about that we're doing West Coast Judaism, even though we're not on the West Coast. I mean, I will tell you, I constantly hear from people that think that we are on the West Coast, and that's because of our Husband Family JCC bumper at the beginning. So I think that you're right spiritually, and I also think that everybody thinks it anyway. So, I mean, at some point I want to talk about the online space as maybe another coast. And it's definitely a coast, I think, that's closer to the West Coast than to the East Coast. So we should talk about that later. So I guess what I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit more is like, not on the side of that the West Coast has the capacity to do interesting things because of wealth and because of being willing to break things and all that, but just on the sense of like the Jewish sensibility that you experience from people who live on the West Coast. Could you describe a little more for folks on the East Coast, like how they really experience Judaism?
And between, gonna speak up for those who are not just on the coast and those in between.
Sure, for everybody on all coasts and in between. Like, how do you see it as the West Coast folks are really experience Judaism in a different way than folks in other places?
We are different, and it's partly because of the geography, partly because of the mindset. But like you said, it's also partly because our willingness to do things a little differently. There's this old term, I think it's from the 1990s, this idea of the mashup, right? This idea of mashing things up. And I feel like West Coast folks are much more willing to mash things up. There was a rabbi out here named Alan Liu of blessed memory, who was kind of known as one of the first Jew boos, right? Because he worked Buddhism into a lot of his Jewish practices. He was a conservative rabbi. He was not somebody who was part of the newer movements, think Reconstructionist movement, right? He was a firmly conservative rabbi, but he was a Jew boo. And he kind of, I think the book that he wrote was the Sound of One God Clapping. He really was willing to embrace Buddhist practices in a way that may have made Jews on the East Coast a little bit more uncomfortable. But think about how meditation has become such a part of our lives now, Dan, or how yoga is a part of people's lives now. And those have roots, deep spiritual roots in Eastern religion, right? And a lot of West Coast Jews were the first ones to adapt this. And this is my point, is that we're a little bit quicker to adapt things maybe out here on the West Coast. I remember when Jeremy brought the board of the Foundation for Jewish Camp out to the West Coast a few years ago. This was pre-COVID. And he wanted to show them some of the cool Jewish camps out here. And he had me speak to the board. And I said, look, folks, you may not like it, but you are going to have to accept that intermarriage is here to stay, right? Like coming soon to a theater near you, like intermarriage on the West Coast is a reality. And if you keep saying on the East Coast that this is the worst thing for Jewish life and it's destroying the Jewish future, you are not going to be seeing this as the opportunity for a plus one. You're going to keep seeing it as a minus one. And the board was kind of like, oh, how could you say that? Because they're still in that old school mentality, Dan. And I think that what the West Coast mindset allows us to do is just maybe be early adopters. And that's what's going to be the differentiator, right? It's not that this way is better. It's not that it's something that we're advocating for necessarily. It's that it's going to hit us first, and then it's going to come to the East Coast, right?
So I'm flashing to, I think, a quote that we've mentioned on the podcast before, like a little aphorism, but the Jews are like everyone else, only more so. That's, your classic quote. And there's a certain way, I mean, I will say I might not be as thoroughly convinced about the uniqueness of some of the West Coast qualities you're talking about, but I do think there is a way in which West Coast Jews are like the rest of American Jews, only more so, to parallel that phrase. And what I mean by that is there's literal, we could look at actual demographic data around this, but there's evidence that when we talk about key trends in contemporary Judaism, I mean, we were just talking about intermarriage, that's one important one to talk about. There is a way in which you can see through data that looks city by city or different areas of the country that a greater percentage of Jews, I'm not just going to say the West Coast, but let's say in the western half of the country, they are more integrated into interfaith families numbers-wise than those who live in the most Jewish areas of the country, percentage-wise, which is to say like the New York City area and some other areas of the Northeast. And by the way, that kind of makes sense intuitively, right? Like if you're in a context where Jews are not as large of a population group, the odds of any particular Jew mixing romantically with somebody who isn't Jewish go up. And so there's a way in which I see that as a distinct positive piece of what West Coast Judaism brings to the forefront, which is there is a way in which Jews are sort of society. End of the day, I think Jews are people more than they are Jews sometimes. And the West side of the country helps to illuminate that. But the question I do have, starting to get towards your book that you've written, what are some of the key forces that led you to want to write this? Like what are maybe some misunderstandings that people have out there about where Judaism is or could be that you felt the need to sort of intervene? Not that you're like putting out a fire, but that you're joining into a conversation through this book. Like what are you looking to confront there?
At its heart, it's the title of the book, Why Do Jewish? I feel like people are not able to answer that question for themselves anymore about why. Why is this important? And I reframed the question from why be Jewish to why do Jewish. I actually was doing research when I was writing the book, and there are 4 books out there with the title, Why Be Jewish? There are no books out there with the title, Why Do Jewish? We on this podcast in our world have used that terminology of doing Jewish. We've used it as a verb before. And there are some other thought leaders in our space that have. But I choose to think about this in terms of the doing. But it's at its heart, Lex, it's about why. We have to be able to answer that question of why, because thoughtful people can answer the question of why they do anything, or otherwise they're going to stop doing it. I have a friend who I grew up with, a high school buddy who I remember this very clearly. He came home with a non-Jewish girlfriend one day, and his father flipped out on him, just flipped out. I thought it was going to be like a Tevye moment from Fiddler on the Roof, tearing the clothes and disowning him, right? And I didn't understand why, because this was a kid who, yes, we were Jewish. We both went to Hebrew school together, had our bar mitzvahs, but that was it for him. And so clearly his parents never made it clear to him why his Jewishness was important. They couldn't answer that question, or they didn't answer that question. Why be Jewish? Why do Jewish? So when he comes home with a non-Jewish girlfriend, I thought it was so hypocritical for them to rip into him. Like, God forbid you should be dating a non-Jewish girl. And in my mind, Lex, it comes back to that ability to answer the question why. Because if we can say why we do this thing that's so special to us, that we want our kids to do it, that no matter who we choose to spend the rest of our lives with, we're going to keep doing this Jewish thing because it provides meaning for us. It gives us values. It provides guardrails for how we live our lives. It makes us better human beings. That's why we do this thing called Jewish. But I needed to be able to answer that for myself, Lex, and I need to be able to answer for my kids, God willing, one day my grandkids, and my community. Because if you can answer that question, then you can get into those other deeper questions that we love to debate. Like, okay, is the God part also vital to this equation? Is the Israel piece vital to this equation? Is the prayer or spirituality piece, is Shabbat an important part of this equation? Is the bagels and lox part? I actually get really upset when people disparagingly call somebody a bagels and lox Jew, as if that's like not legit, right? And I think it's a very legit way. And food is a very easy portal of entry for doing Jewish. But that maybe shouldn't be where it stops. Maybe that's the way somebody can learn about their, whether it's pastrami and knish or modern Yotam Matalenge food, or whether it's, another quick story is like when we were opening a cafe on the JCC's campus, I wanted to have a Jewish food cafe. And immediately I thought, all right, pastrami, knish, matzo ball soup. And half of my community was like, awesome, Jewish food. You're going to have hummus and falafel and trina. And Israelis. Why? Because they're Israelis. And in their mind, that's Jewish food today. So that's an example of how we can't look through that Ashken normative lens anymore that you and we've all talked about. But it also gives a sense of why, in my mind, you have to be able to answer the why. Why is this important to our heritage, our past, and our future, our legacy, and our destiny?
So let's really sit with the word why. We're big on whys on this podcast. I mean, your book and our podcast have mentioned that TED Talk, Start With Why, all about whys. I actually, the word why in English, I think is a deficient word. In other languages, the word, in a lot of different languages. So in Spanish, the word for why is por qué, 2 parts. Por being for and que being what. For what? In French, pourquoi, for what? In Hebrew even, which not a related language, lama, which is le, for, ma, what? Like, why is a way of asking what is something for? Like, what's it for? And I think that there's something about saying that directly in the two parts of pour que, pourquoi, lama in those other languages that helps get at that more directly. But what I liked about your book is that implicitly it understands that because you talk about why, and you also talk about the what. You like what even is Jewish as a noun, Jewish being a noun in your book's terms. So I guess I would be curious to hear from you on that front. What is Jewish? And my conception of Jewish, which I actually think you share, is that Judaism is constantly experiencing all sorts of changes such that the what at any given time becomes different. It's almost like, where people lose their skin cells, like every cell in our body is replaced however long. Like, I feel like that's how Judaism is. And so I'd actually argue that Judaism today is maybe almost entirely a different thing from what it was a few thousand years ago. So how would you tie together these why do Jewish questions and what even is the Jewish that one would do?
Yeah, I love that. The book is divided into three parts, kind of why do Jewish, what is Jewish, and then how to do Jewish. And we've talked on this podcast about being in a new era of Judaism. And Lex, to your point, that would suggest that Judaism is evolving. But when I started playing out the thoughts around the evolution of Judaism, it was actually in a conversation with Avram Infeld, who said, I prefer to think of this a little bit differently. And that's where I kind of moved from the terminology of Judaism to Jewish peoplehood, because Jewish peoplehood embraces all of these elements, right, Lex? It doesn't put us squarely in the bounds of a religion. Mordecai Kaplan had this way of defining what it means to be Jewish with his 3 B's, as he said, right? It's belonging, behaving, and believing. And in talking to Avram Infeld, he was like, look, I think we need to move away from the terminology even of Judaism and talk about Jewish peoplehood, because it's embracing a lot bigger picture. And as we've talked about on your podcast before, we all believe that since the Enlightenment, things have started to shift. How people see their Jewishness is different today than it was. Because 200 years ago, even, if you were Jewish, it defined how you dressed, what you ate, who you married, what you did for a living, where you lived. Today, if you're Jewish, it could just be one piece of your identity. And it might not be your full identity. It might no longer be your operating system, your OS. It could just be an app, as we've talked about. So that would suggest that you're right, Lex, that Jewish peoplehood, Judaism evolves over time, and it looks different for people. And we need to accept that. We need to embrace that. We need to recognize that it's no longer a monolithic thing. And we who have experienced and been exposed to Jews who look different, who talk different, who eat different, we recognize that. But I still think that a lot of folks see the old ways as authentic Judaism, and anything that looks different and new as inauthentic. And that's a challenge that we have.
And my question about the concept of Jewish peoplehood as solving the problem that the word Judaism has, which is to say that I don't necessarily, I'm not saying one thing or another about peoplehood as its own concept. I'm just asking this question whether it solves the problem, is that it feels to me like as we have a growing variety of ways to express or live out one's Judaism, you start to see divergence. You start to see, whether it could be West Coast, East Coast, but it could be ultra-Orthodox versus, secular Israeli or whatever, wherever you want to put the poles. At some point, do you kind of maybe at a certain point you migrate far enough away from each other that either you're not a people anymore in the way that matters, or you can say that we're a people, and this is the thing that I'm struggling with the concept of peoplehood as a substitute for Judaism, is that, okay, we can say we're the same people, but really, what does that matter anymore? Because it's such a huge tent that it captures so much that it kind of doesn't really do the work that we need, and that I think your book is trying to advocate for, which is to say to every person, hey, you should really do this hard work of trying to figure out, a way to be Jewish that's meaningful to you.
I think that question, Dan, is at the heart of bringing us back together as a people in some ways. And I know we can argue over this, whether we're still part of the same family or whether we're so different that we're no longer part of the same family. But I would argue that we are. I know when I sit around my Passover Seder table and we argue about politics, holy cow, I can't believe that some of these people are in the same family as me, right? But we have become so partisanized, we've become so polarized that we now have Democratic synagogues and Republican synagogues. It's almost a shame because people have forgotten what ties us together. And that's part of what I was trying to do with the element of this book, with the third chapter of the book, essentially, Lex, is about the how to do Jewish. I've kind of identified these 7 different buckets, and I've tied them to the word tachlis. I love this word tachlis. Tachlis is a Yiddish word that's been brought into the Hebrew modern day nomenclature, and it means kind of getting down to business, getting down to brass tacks. It's like, let's just do this. When people in a meeting are talking way too much, feel free to say to them, "No, what's the tachlis?" Like, let's get down to business, right? This tachlis, which I've turned into this acronym, the T is tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. A is art and culture. C is community. H is holidays and rituals. L is learning. I is Israel. And S is Shabbat and spirituality. And Dan, if we could take some of those aspects, I'm not even saying all 7, but some of those aspects and embrace them, then we can see that we have so much in common with Jews around the world with differing opinions and differing backgrounds. And that can bring us back together, I think, in so many ways.
So I love that you brought up the Democratic and Republican synagogues piece, because that in your book was one of the parts that I found most provocative. I'm going to be blunt. I think I would have a better time navigating my way around Jewish institutional life and finding meaning personally and finding community if the structures of our Jewish institutions were more like, here are the progressive institutions, whatever, and here are the Republican ones, conservative ones, and by the way, and here are the centrist ones, whatever. Like, I actually would prefer that. And I think that for me, it is, I think because we sort of inherited a certain structure, we find all sorts of reasons to like that structure. But I actually think we could look at our structure of Jewish denominational synagogues and we could say, what a tragedy that I grew up going, I'm just going to speak from my own experience. And I loved I had a perfectly good experience with my synagogue. But we could back out and say, how tragic that I grew up in a synagogue where everybody there in some way was sort of affiliating with the Reform movement. There was no active voicing of other movements. I did not know what a Reconstructionist was. I had a sense of what Orthodox was because it sort of predominates in many ways. But I didn't have any of those people in my community. On the peoplehood front, we actually were not at all a cross-section of all Jews. We were a specific cross-section because at the end of the day, synagogues make decisions about what they are and what they are not. And to me, it's neither better nor worse to envision a world where, say, you had a synagogue that said, what we stand for is not being Reform, it's not being conservative, it's not being Reconstructionist. We are a synagogue for people who oppose Donald Trump. That could be a synagogue. You'd have a lack of a political diversity. From my perspective, I struggle more inhabiting spaces that have a lack of what I would term sort of spiritual diversity, like different ways of celebrating holidays, I love sharing spaces where the same prayer, you have people that would say it different ways, or some would skip it and others would use it. I love those communities and I inhabit many of them. I'd rather share one of those communities with people who are all progressive. So you've got progressive folks, radical, leftist, liberal, roughly people on the left half of political society who are incredibly diverse in terms of how they practice Judaism. That to me is exciting. Even as I recognize it's not all of the Jews, right? It's not on the peoplehood front capturing everybody. I just think that when we imagine that we have diversity right now, because we have Republicans and Democrats sharing a space, I think we're actually overstating the diversity that we have because end of the day, a Reform synagogue identifies as Reform.
Lex, I just want to point out the inconsistency though in the logic of that argument. You actually want a place where there is spiritual diversity. You don't want to be pigeonholed into this is just Reform. You want to be able to bring in a little Reconstructionist here, but you don't want diversity of political opinion.
Correct.
Which is your right.
I want to be clear that that's exactly the inconsistency that I'm saying. I wouldn't call it an inconsistency. I think it's a choice. I think people at the end of the day can't fully inhabit spaces that have no definitions whatsoever, and so we make different decisions. I'm arguing that the decisions we've made so far around not having spiritual diversity or denominational diversity, maybe more accurately, but cherishing viewpoint diversity, like political diversity across Republican, Democrat, whatever. I think that choice is problematic and can even be dangerous for people who in a space that transcends all political viewpoints might actually not be safe.
Okay. I would suggest that only gives you a small perspective of a percentage of our people, right? Whether it's American, whether it's Jew, right? Okay. So like we all like novels and books where your protagonist and your characters are multi-layered. Whenever somebody's painted as unidimensional, we're kind of like, it's not as great a book. So I would suggest that our exposure to people who have different political, religious opinions makes us richer in so many ways, Lex. I mean, I think about the fact that when I do sit around my Passover table or my regular Shabbat table, and we have these debates and these arguments, whether it's about Israel, whether it's about American politics, it makes me frustrated sometimes, but that's my mosaic. That's my family. And I'm not going to write off a child or a parent or a grandparent because they have different political opinions. So what are you going to say, Lex, when you have a kid, God willing, one day who decides to become, a right-wing conservative Republican? Are you going to say, you know what, you go find your own shul to daven in because I don't have anything in common with you?
Honestly, I think it would hurt my soul a little more. I don't actually know this. I don't have a kid. I can't say this with certainty. I think it would hurt my soul more if the vision you're describing were to happen and I had a child who identified so politically differently from how I do that it would make it hard to share any kind of common ground. I think that would hurt me more than if how they practice Judaism or even the extent to which they practice Judaism was radically different from my own. And I'm saying that not because it's about me so much, but I think, there's studies out there about millennials, right? And I would never think twice and didn't think twice about entering into a relationship with somebody who isn't Jewish, right? Would I think twice before entering into a relationship with somebody who is a conservative Republican? Not only would I think twice, to me, I can't really imagine that ever working. All I'm getting at is that we basically make choices about which kinds of diversity we welcome in our communities and which we don't. The current choice we've created, synagogue-wise, is that there is not diversity across denominations. Most synagogues, although there are exceptions, there are unaffiliated synagogues, there are synagogues that bridge some of these questions, but most synagogues have said, we want to define ourselves a specific way that is not everyone's way. A Reform synagogue that I grow up in Milwaukee is saying we ultimately aren't creating a space for the Orthodox Jews that live 3 miles down the block. By the way, I lived down the block from an Orthodox yeshiva that came over and watched football every Sunday of football season for many years. That was good that I was exposed to those people. Do I think it's a tragedy that a synagogue existed where it defined itself in a way that Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews were not both there? No, I don't really think that's a tragedy. I think that's a natural thing. And so I'm just saying, we could imagine a parallel universe where we're drawing starker contrasts around politics and not just around sort of religious practice.
I understand what you're saying, and I respect your position on it. I happen to come from a different place. I think we become better people when we are exposed to differences of opinions. I mean, you guys introduced me the term Ashkenormative, right? And it's almost this perspective of, look, we have to own our history, our tradition, how we were raised. But in this modern era, we have to recognize that there are other authentic, genuine Jewish experiences. And not all of them came through the point of view of somebody with a Polish or a Russian background. And so merging these cultures is a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. There's an open-mindedness that you have, Lex, that recognizes that Yiddish is not just the ancient Jewish language, that there are languages like Ladino, right? But to not accept that there are Jews of differing opinions, and it's not to say that you don't accept that. You recognize that. You just have chosen, I don't want to be in a congregation with them. But I would suggest that they're still a part of our family and our people. And by you not exposing yourself to them on a regular basis, it may wall you off a little bit. You guys love B'nai Lappe. I think, Dan, you and B'nai are best friends.
I love B'nai.
Her theory that she has shared with us on this show is about a sociological crash, right? When somebody's Weltanschauung, when somebody's worldview hits up against a wall and says, whoa, this is what it looks like, that she says you could take 3 courses of action. 1, double down and put up bigger walls. And that's what kind of the Orthodox, don't look at the TV, don't look at the internet. 2, you could drop it all together and say, whoa, this new worldview, look, turns out the world's not flat. You just drop the old way of thinking. And 3 is this innovation, which I think all of us together, the 3 of us, believe in innovation. We believe in forging a new path. We believe in taking some of our old and merging it with the new. And by not exposing yourself to a variety of opinions and different worldviews out there, you could be limiting yourself to how your worldview might innovate in the future. That's my only point. So I love basically the JCC as an environment, for instance, because we have folks on the JCC, old, young, Orthodox, secular, believe in God, don't believe in God, right? And we do not have a litmus test that says you have to do X or believe in X to be a certain way. And I love that. And so I want to see those types of communities continue to thrive, Lex. I don't want to see us go down the path of saying, this is just going to be for folks who believe X, and this is just going to be for folks who believe Y.
This is a really helpful conversation for me because it's like helping me solidify certain things. And first of all, like, and I've said this before, like, I'm always a little worried about the metaphors to family stuff because I feel like there's all sorts of complexity, sometimes helpful, sometimes unhelpful. And I worry about getting too locked into that metaphor, even though, by the way, I'm about to make one. The one that I'm about to make, Zack, is that I feel like all of a sudden I felt this like love for you. Like I feel this love for my beloved uncle who's totally into genealogy. Like he loves the family. Like, and he's actually kind of asked me to take over for him, you know? And I will, and I care about it, and I will do my best, but I don't love it the way he loves it. You know, I'm interested in it, but it's spiritually important for him. And like, that's his role in our family, you know, and our family is better because he's there and plays that role. If he were not there, our family would have drifted apart more than it has. But our family has also drifted apart more than he would have wished, you know, and so in a way, it's just the way life is. And it's good that there are people that are playing these different roles. And, you know, and I'm probably a little closer to Lex, or maybe a lot closer to Lex than I am to, in the sense that, like, I'm not sure that this is like my top priority of you know, like the sort of family dimension. And I definitely do feel I'd rather spend most of my time. It's not just that I'd rather, like, I think the thing that I'm in search of in Judaism is meaning. I want Judaism to be so meaningful to me that it's hard for me to imagine how I'm part of the same peoplehood in a way that matters with somebody whose interpretation of Judaism is so profoundly different from mine. And not only politically, but let's say somebody who doesn't believe in egalitarianism for women, or let's say somebody who doesn't have the sort of love and honor for trans folks that I do. At the end of the day, I am going to spend my time with the people whose vision of Judaism is closer to my vision of Judaism. Now, that said, I am really grateful to have your voice in my life saying, but don't just leave it all behind, you know? So I'm thinking about, like, okay, how do we look at your book and at anybody's book and say that what your book is contributing is like, hey, if this speaks to you, you should be the beloved uncle in the Jewish people as well. And I was actually thinking specifically about institutions, because one thing that I was thinking early, flashing back to the beginning of our conversation about West Coast Judaism, like one thing that I was thinking about was that maybe the difference between West Coast and East Coast, and Lex, I agree, there's every coast in between, including where I am, but I'm just for the rhetorical part here, that the Jews are the same in the West Coast and the East Coast, more or less. The difference is that the East Coast, the institutions are more powerful, and and there's more of them, and they're kind of suppressing the element of the regular Jews that wants to sort of like break free, you know, that wants to do. And in the West Coast, it's more open. And I'm thinking about your book as a manifesto by one institution leader, and specifically a JCC institution leader, because I think you said earlier that the JCC may have a particular role in this story. And I'm curious about, like, what your hope is, and or what you already know in terms of other institutional leaders, maybe on the East Coast, right, where it's harder, that would pick up your book, and like, how might they lead differently so that they would be leading better? And by better, I mean better for the future of the Jewish people.
I have to share my humility that I've learned that this is my manifesto. This is a manifesto that I have a perch here in Silicon Valley, but is by no means the perch. So there's a lot of folks leading a lot of institutions doing incredible things, wonderful things. And a lot of them are on the East Coast. And I quote Rabbi Angela Buchdahl as an example, right? She's somebody who has really made radical inclusivity a whole part of her congregation. So there are institutions that are paving a new path that I hope that we learn from each other. So Dan, yes, it's important for you to take on the roles in the family that you know are important that you may not love, that you can go back and forth. If that's the beloved uncle doing the genealogy, fine. But there's also the importance of working with the other people for whom this is their passion, right? And I do think that there are other institutions that we need to be playing nicer with in the sandbox. We need to be learning from. And we need to kind of all check our arrogance at the door. And I'm the first one to acknowledge that I don't know much here. And we need to bring in the great providers of content. And frankly, that's what we're doing. And we partner with you. We partner with Bina and 929 and partner with Pardes and all these other great institutions of higher Jewish learning, because they're better at this than us. But if we just locked ourselves into our specific point of view, it is not going to allow us to grow and flourish and, frankly, I think evolve for the future.
Shifting gears a little bit, Zack, I was curious about this idea. I think there's a good test case for the distinction between being Jewish and doing Jewish, because you talk a bit in the book about the idea that a non-Jewish person can do Jewish and that you actually know a bunch of them that do. And some non-Jews who might do Jewish are members of families that include Jews. But I'm actually also curious whether you see possibilities that even go beyond that. Do you see possibilities that other non-Jews might find doing Jewish to be a valuable part of their life, and that might actually help us expand the idea of what we mean by Jewish, just by having in our heads the possibility that Jewish isn't only something that a Jew might do?
I hope so. I hope it will in the future. I think that it's a little bit easier and more palatable when it's somebody who's not Jewish by birth or by conversion, who's attached to a Jewish family. And I tell the story in the book of a member of our board of directors. She's not Jewish. She didn't convert. And she is married to a Jewish guy, but she's the one carrying the torch for the Judaism in her family. Right? She's the one who schlepped the kids to the JCC preschool. She's now taking her oldest to bar mitzvah classes. She's the one who makes the Passover Seder with these really cool Japanese influences, by the way. She's the one who does Shabbat dinners. She's actually co-chairing our mission to Israel this summer. She's doing it, right? So I feel like she's part of our Jewish mishpacha, part of our Jewish family. But that's an easier example, Dan, than the one you talk about of people who have absolutely no attachment because they're not married or they don't have a parent or a grandparent. So if a bunch of non-Jews said, hey, we need to start doing Shabbat, good for us for giving them that gift. And by the way, we do have that in our preschool. I've got tons of non-Jewish families that love Shabbat. There is this couple here that graduated their last kid from our preschool a couple of years ago that I said to them, like I say to many of our couples, like, we love that you're here. Why do you send your kid to our preschool? They said, we love the Jewish values. Absolutely love it. And I said, but you're not Jewish. I said, yeah, but they've taught us things. And they told me the story about how now, because of Shabbat, they do a family Friday night dinner. Every Friday night, they do a family Friday night dinner. And they told me that they would have to come and they'd have to get their challah from the JCC. They went on a camping trip, sitting around the campfire. They still need to have their challah because that's part of their tradition. And now, many years later, the mom tells me that they make homemade challah every Friday as part of their family Friday night dinner. They unplug, they put their cell phones away, they have a real conversation because they learned about Shabbat from a JCC experience. That's an example of how a non-Jewish family is embracing a Shabbat ritual, a Jewish value, and it's making their lives better. And that, to me, is how we can become a light unto the nations, and that really excites me.
Look, we have talked a lot about different geographic questions, and the question I have now, in a sense, I would argue, is about simultaneously the West Coast and the East Coast and the Midwest Coast, which is not a coast, the Midwest and the South. But I want to talk about the digital coast that Dan used as a phrase earlier, because I've been doing digital Judaism workshops, and synagogues bring me sometimes offline before the pandemic, but now mostly online during the pandemic to, speak to them. And I often begin by asking where we are. Like, where are we right now? And as I speak to you right now, I'm in a Zoom room. And so one cop out is to say, like, we're in a Zoom room. But like the next level is like, where am I, Lex, right now? So I am sitting, my body is in Providence, Rhode Island. If you were to track my phone, it would say I'm in Providence, Rhode Island. My face and avatar are in Palo Alto right now. Like, you're looking at me. And we could say that that's not actually me, right? That's just sort of my face. That's just a picture of me. But I am, in a sense, with you, Zack, in Palo. And also Dan is in Chicago. And I would argue there's a way in which each of the three of us is actually in quotes, each of the other places that we're interacting. And I say that because I believe that we're still not quite understanding, not you, Zack, but like we as a society, as Jews, are not quite understanding what's happening with digital Judaism. Because what's happening is not, oh, wow, people in isolated communities are able to like join a New York City synagogue or a San Francisco synagogue or a Milwaukee synagogue or whatever. Like, yes, they might be zooming into a service that their sibling is at and that sibling lives somewhere else. But when I talk to these communities in these Zoom workshops, I say, okay, if you have a bunch of family members that are in Missouri and they're joining your space, and let's say they make up a quarter of the space for a Torah study, that space is now, the context of that space is now a quarter Missouri. Like it's actually transformed. It's not all yours anymore, wherever like the home base of the community is. And so all of these geography questions that we're talking about, there's a part of me that thinks in 100 years, everybody will look at it and be like, huh, that's so fascinating. There was once a time where it mattered that there was like East Coast Jews and West Coast Jews, because now it doesn't matter at all because we're interacting without regard to that. Like I joke, at first it was a joke, but now I actually think I mean it seriously. Like in a typical week, I'm having a Zoom call or a meeting or something with somebody in California or maybe somebody in Texas or maybe so. And like I've said to friends like, oh, I got to go. I've got a meeting in Texas. I don't really, but I also do really. And so my question to you is how might we take these questions to the next level and think really future tense about how, you know, whether it's the West Coast, East Coast distinctions, whether it's peoplehood questions. And by the way, peoplehood can thrive online in a way that it can't offline because you actually can have one space that everybody goes to. Like my question is, how do we reconceptualize these questions about peoplehood, about doing Jewish in a context where our geographies are digital?
On the one hand, I hate that we can't get together in person and hug each other because of COVID. It started that way, right? The virtual space became a reality for many of us because of COVID. You guys were ahead of the times, and you were recognizing this. Heschel talks about making time sacred on Shabbat because the rest of the week we're always making space sacred. So Jews in sacred space, that's a thing. We've been having this conversation, since the early days. But I'm torn on this because on the one hand, I'll tell you a quick story. When my father passed away, I wanted to say Kaddish for him every day. And I'm a member of several synagogues. None of them are Orthodox, so none of them have a daily minyan. And anyway, I wanted to say it with my brother who lives in Colorado. We wanted to say Kaddish together. We thought that would be a cool thing. And the rabbis were like, look, you can't really do that virtually. You have to be in the same room. In fact, you can't even be in the same room around a corner. I learned all the halacha, the Jewish law around saying Kaddish for a parent. And I was like, well, that's a bummer. What about these Jews who live in the middle of nowhere, Montana or Juneau, Alaska? What if they just physically can't get, I can get a minyan. And I ended up doing that. I went to the Orthodox Kollel on our campus here, but I still wanted to daven, virtually with my brother and say Kaddish. And what about all these folks who can't? And so I do believe in the power of virtual to bring us together, right? Like, I'll tell you a quick story about that, but then I want to provide the other side. Like, we had a guy who came to our community from New York. He was raised in an Orthodox community, Lex, and he came out as gay. And the Orthodox community in New York had a bit of a hard time with that, came out to San Francisco, the Bay Area, found a very warm and welcoming community here, fell in love with a Hindu man. And then he found like he was missing his tradition. He wanted to get back into Jewish learning. So he started visiting some of the more Orthodox communities. They had real authentic Jewish learning in his mind, but they weren't as open to his way of life. Went into the more progressive Reform synagogues, which were very open to his partner and their way of life, but he couldn't find the real deep meaning in the learning. So he found us because of our learning that we do with you on Judaism Unbound and Binah. He fell in love with our learning. And over time, there was COVID. We went online, we became virtual, and he was able to reach out to his mom in New York and say, Mom, I really want you to zoom in for this learning. You're going to see it's legit. And because of the natural mechitza, the divider between, she felt comfortable in this virtual space. And sure enough, it was able to rejuvenate her relationship. So her son and her, like mother and son, were brought back together because of the beauty of a virtual space, Lex. On the other hand, you and I can't dance the hora together virtually. I can't lift you up on a chair virtually.
I've
very
tried.
clear.
I can send. I have lifted my friends' videos of their weddings onto a chair and sent them a video of that afterwards. But I agree with you. Yes,
But it's not the same. It's just not the same. Giving each other a hug, being there for a Shiva minion. Yes, we're all doing it virtually now because we have to because of COVID. But getting that hug when you need it is not the same virtually. And I think during COVID, we all learned that, okay, virtual and tech is creating so many wonderful, beautiful things, which, as you said, I mentioned in my book, we have to embrace. And yet there are limitations to that, Lex. So we have to own that.
First of all, I just want to say that I'm fascinated by that idea of the internet sort of being experienced as a mechitza, which is a divider between men and women in an Orthodox setting, because it's interesting in a way that I never really thought about how a technological change can actually bring about more of the kind of peoplehood that you're talking about, right? Because it makes something that would be impossible or largely impossible physically, makes it possible if you see it a certain way. So I think that's a fascinating. I got to work with that one for a while. I think that's a really interesting story. I was thinking about something that struck me when I was reading your book, and what I'm interested in is I'm thinking a lot about the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. I don't know if you've been watching the show. There's a show on Apple TV Plus, and the basic idea, you should watch it. The basic idea is that this guy has discovered that the empire is crumbling, and when the empire crumbles, there's going to be 30,000 years of misery. But if you can do a few certain things, it'll only be 1,000 years of misery. So first of all, I love the idea that it's still 1,000 years of misery, and that's a good thing. But I also think the idea is like what he's saying to essentially the emperor is there is nothing you can do to stop this. And it feels to me like a lot of institutions, a lot of Jewish institutions, first of all, I guess they just don't believe that, they don't believe it's coming. And I know you love to tell the story about Yochanan ben Zakkai and the fall of Jerusalem, but they don't believe it's really going to happen. But maybe they do, and they just the only Judaism that I think is legitimate is the kind of Judaism that we do, and so I'm going to go down with the ship. You don't lead that way. And it's not just that you have a place at the JCC that is kind of parv, where everybody can feel part of it. Like you actually bring voices into the JCC that are at odds with one another, you're trying to make it a place that everybody can be part of it, but that doesn't mean that you're never going to be uncomfortable. I would love to know more about how, as a institutional leader, you envision a space that would be the kind of Jewish space that we need to have the kind of Jewish world that you imagine, and maybe even just to dream about things that you haven't yet done or you haven't been able to do. And like, what would that, JCC 3.0 look like?
Big question. And I feel like, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, to make a little bit older reference rather than the new Foundation, Dan. But if we go down fighting, there's some honor in that. On the other hand, if you could see the writing on the wall, why not just get there quicker? And if you could see that something is going to very quickly or slowly become irrelevant, why not speed that process up and make the change? And so I think that what we need to be thinking about in terms of a JCC is how we can be do tanks. There are think tanks out there and there are thought leaders, but let's create a new terminology around do tanks and do leaders. And just like there are medical schools attached to teaching hospitals, why not make Jewish institutions attaching themselves to Jewish studies departments or yeshivas or rabbinic seminaries? Why not make institutions the do tanks where we can try out things? Make it a place where some of this stuff is going to stick and keep going, but some of the stuff is going to fall away. And that's how we're able to still keep our institutions relevant, while there may be pieces of it within that aren't. You guys are big fans of reinventing Jewish ritual. At what point does it go too far? It's a conversation we're actually in the middle of right now with Hanukkah, right? At what point does Hellenized Judaism no longer look like Judaism? It just becomes a new Hellenized thing. And I don't know, Dan. I don't know, Lex. I think that this is the question that we're trying to get to the heart of every single day, but we have to be willing to experiment, push the boundaries, pull back a little if we feel like it's gone too far. And that's what I think institutions like JCCs, to be relevant and meaningful for the future, have to become.
Thank you so much, Zack, for joining the show again. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks, Lex. Thanks for having me. It's great to spend time with you. And thanks, Dan, also for always asking the provocative questions. I always appreciate it.
And thanks, of course, also to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We also hope that you'll head to our show notes page where you can find a link to Why Do Jewish by Zack Bodner and check it out if you feel called to do so. And we always close our episodes with a call to you to be in touch with us, and we're definitely going to do that today as well. Here are all the different ways that you can do so. First, there are Facebook and Twitter and Instagram pages. You can hit us up at those. They're all at Judaism Unbound. You can send us an email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com. And in addition to being in touch with us, you can also support us financially. We greatly appreciate that, especially this Hanukkah gift giving season. You can head to judaismunbound.com/donate and make a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. You can also buy some swag, buy a mug, buy a tote bag, buy a t-shirt, buy a hoodie, buy anything. We've got not quite anything, but a lot of things in our store, which you can find at judaismunbound.com/store. So we hope that you'll be in touch with us. We hope that you'll head to all of those different pages. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.